You're listening to Solihull Radio.
That's right, you are listening to Solihull Radio. My name is Geoff O'Brien. I'm joined live in the studio by Claire Bullivant, who has become my Brexit sort of consultant over the last couple of podcasts that we've recorded. But we've gone one better this time. We are joined on the telephone by Professor Alex de Ruyter. Now, he is the head and director of the Centre for Brexit Studies over at Birmingham City University. Alex, are you well?
Yes, I'm well, Geoff. Thank you.
Excellent stuff. Now, thank you so much for joining us here on our podcast. It is labelled our Brexit podcast. Over the last 24, 48 hours, Alex, I suspect you've been rather busy.
Yes, I have had quite a bit of media interest, as it were, with various outlets. So, when you get calls to do interviews at midnight and that kind of thing, you're sort of on demand, as it were.
That's right. Well, thank you very much for joining us here at Solihull Radio. We appreciate your time. Like I say, last 24 hours. What's your take on the sort of things that have been happening down at the Palace of Westminster?
Well, I mean, very simply put, Boris Johnson, of course, has lost his majority in Parliament with Philip Lee crossing the floor to the Liberal Democrats. Mm-hmm. So he has no majority. As his opponents like to point out, he hasn't got a mandate because he hasn't been able to go to the polls to seek one. And he doesn't have a clear approach to Brexit other than what his detractors would say is a deliberate pursuit of no deal.
But Alex, I'm going to jump in here. Would he be telling us exactly what his approach is at the moment? Because can we not just feel maybe a little bit of empathy for him?
As an academic, I would suggest that I think when you enter into the hot seat like that, you have to be prepared to be under scrutiny. And of course, if you're seen to be not fully transparent with your plans, then the opposition parties are quite entitled to ask questions of you in that regard. We have, for example, the Prime Minister stating that, he's up in the ante on negotiations with Brussels, and yet we have Michel Barnier today saying that negotiations are at an impasse. So who do you believe? I'm inclined to suggest that the EU bureaucrats are more factual in that regard. In terms of sympathy, well, he entered into the contest for the leadership knowing full well that his majority was wafer thin, so he took the role on that basis. His approach to the job so far seems to be what a Labour Prime Minister in Australia many years ago referred to as a crash-through or crash philosophy. Compromise does not seem to be the forte of his administration at the moment. The brazen kicking out, as it were, by denying the whip to 21 Tory MPs is a blatant example of that.
I'm just thinking, though he's lost his hand, hasn't he? He's lost his negotiating tool of the no deal. He's not being given the opportunity now of a general election with Corbyn taking that away from him. What's Corbyn's plan, do you think? Is Corbyn just going to drive down the time to force Boris to be unpowerful and not be able to do anything and make sure Brexit is stopped that way? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I suppose political parties are always trying to pursue things that would give them maximum gain, isn't it? They're not going to engage in behaviour which they think is giving a free kick to the opposition. And certainly for the Labor Party, their great fear is that if they were to agree to an election now, once Parliament is dissolved, of course, the Prime Minister would have a free hand to change the date of the election to a time to suit them. So until they see that threat, as they put it, removed, they're not going to enter into that territory. So what options does Boris Johnson have available at the moment? Well, he could try and come back and put another vote out there to try and get the numbers for an election, but I suspect he would be defeated again, so that doesn't look likely. He could try and amend the provisions of the Fixed Term Parliament Act that, require him to get 2/3 of MPs to support an election in order to dissolve Parliament. He might try and amend it in this occasion to say that he only needs a simple majority due to special circumstances. But of course, anything he brings to Parliament could in itself be the subject of hostile amendments by the opposition. It is entirely possible he could try that, and the Labor Party or some such could put up an amendment saying, well, we'll agree to that if you give 16 and 17-year-olds the vote, or even more brazenly, if you give EU nationals the vote who have been resident in this country for a particular period of time. So anything he tries legislatively to try and get around the strictures of the Fixed Term Parliament Act are fraught with risk to him. He could take a more nuclear option. He could and this is somewhat bizarrely, he could put a confidence motion out on his own government and then vote against himself.
Didn't he try that?
Fundamentally absurd, but he could try that.
Did he not try that yesterday?
Well, it de facto sense, what he tried to do was to get an election. And what he wants is an election. He said he didn't, but that was, in his view, a de facto confidence motion. But if he were to return again and put a formal confidence motion in his government, you could end up with a situation whereby the opposition MPs could vote for him and he and his MPs could vote against themselves. I just think that's theoretically possible. I don't think it would practically happen. But again, the Fixed Term Parliament Act doesn't allow him to immediately go to an election. It has a 2-week period whereby an alternative government could be formed.
Right.
And it is distinctly possible that you could end up in that situation with Jeremy Corbyn cobbling together enough MPs to become a caretaker Prime Minister, or if Corbyn was not palatable to the centrist political parties and the moderate Tories, you could well end up in a situation where a compromise like Ken Clark, the father of the House, could well end up in a situation as a caretaker PM, the so-called Rainbow Coalition. The Fixed Term Parliament Act does allow for that to emerge, and that would happen first before going to the polls. So anything he tries in that regard would be very risky for him.
Thank goodness we've got people like you who can explain all this, because it's an absolute minefield for the rest of us.
It is. Yes. I mean, I'm an academic. I mean, you asked me, is he deserving of some sympathy in this regard? I mean, the harsh verdict would be no, because he entered into it knowing full well the difficulties he was going to face.
Yeah,
but I think
he's
never been one to lack belief in his own campaigning ability.
Of course, but he also entered into it thinking he was doing the right for the country and what the country voted for. And as a professor, what's your view, having 600 odd people in London making these decisions now when the country voted with a clear majority, and now it's all on the shoulders of these 600 or so MPs who are changing everything?
Well, I mean, there are a few points you can make, or a few observations you can make in regards to that, Claire. And the first one, of course, is that back in the referendum in 2016, the lead protagonist on the Leave side never claimed that no deal would be an acceptable outcome.
Well,
the claims of David Davis, the claims of people like Michael Gove, all at the time were that if the UK were to leave the EU, would keep all the benefits it has now of membership.
You say this, but I've been going back through all the TV recordings and everything, because I've been writing an article about it, and I'm not joking. It's said 1,000 times. Leave means leave, and it really was described like a divorce. And everyone knows what a divorce is. You part, and then often the deals are made after that. And it's said over and over and over again. It's very, very clear. Everyone's now saying it's reported differently, and I just don't feel like it was.
Well, and then I cast my memory back to that period in time, and I would repeat again that the lead protagonists of the Leave side were making statements out that have proven to be unfounded. You can go to Conservative-owned website and read the statements.
I think that's both sides. Has it not been proved that was both sides making statements?
I would suggest again that what happened in 2016 was inadequate in terms of satisfactorily defining just where the UK was going to be. And it's one thing to have a referendum where you say leave means leave, but when you're leaving, you still have to end up somewhere. And the harsh realities of the UK's relationship to the rest of Europe is that its economy is very deeply embedded with other countries such as France and Germany.
But what do
and
you
when
say?
When you take a referendum vote and you try and operationalise that, somebody has to be able to give detailed answers to the businesses who are out there now potentially facing demise because of the impact on their supply chains.
But I think it's a lot of the demise is the unpredictability of it all. Surely if we'd have just left, maybe things could be being made better right now. Who knows? We don't know. That's the question. But
yes, I mean, it's equally probable if the government of the day had just said we are leaving the customs union and the single market, then businesses may have had more time to adjust, but that adjustment, could equally have just been into leaving the UK quicker. I mean, at the end of the day, businesses will do a cost-benefit analysis of the situation.
But
and bear in mind that most
here.
of these businesses concerned revolve around multinationals who make global production decisions. If you add 10% onto their cost base, then you could well rule out producing in period.
But Professor, we've been here before, haven't we? Especially when we had all these experts telling us that after the vote, our economy would die. We've actually grown 1.4% but and from then till now, they said employment would rise. It's now below 4% unemployment. They said investment into the UK would halter. In the last 2 years, the UK have had more investment than Germany and France put together. We're doing really well.
Well, I would beg to differ in that regard. The last quarter of growth was negative, so the UK economy shrank. If we get another quarter of negative growth, we are officially in recession. And whilst we can talk about inward investment flooding into the UK, in terms of actually boosting our productive capacity, so-called greenfield investment, and in terms of net job generation due to foreign direct investment, we've gone backwards. We need to be careful when we look at overall foreign investment figures into the UK, because a lot of that includes mergers and acquisitions and taking over existing businesses. But in terms of new capacity, we're going backwards.
I'm not arguing with you about that. I'm arguing about all the doomsayers who said all these things would happen and they didn't happen. And now you're telling us to listen to them again and...
The converse to that is that Brexit still officially hasn't happened yet. And when you're a business such as Jaguar Land Rover with billions of pounds worth of sunk costs into the UK, and you come along and tell us that the cost of no deal to us would be in the order of £1.5 billion, as our own research has demonstrated, businesses look at the uncertainty around a particular situation and say, we are not going to spend money or make decisions until we absolutely have to. We're all resource constrained. So the fact that the doomsday scenario didn't materialise is there for a simple reason, and that business decisions take time. If you're a car company and you have a production cycle of 5 years, you're not just going to up sticks straight away because you physically just can't do that. But when the time comes to you invest in the plant, for example, Honda down at Swindon, you then make a call and say, oh, goodbye, we're leaving, which is what Honda have done, for example, and which the likes of BMW and Toyota may yet do as well. So, no, I mean, you tried to point out that the predictions were immediate doom and gloom, but they could never be immediate doom and destruction because of the time-dependent nature of production. But we will see that more happen over time. If we leave with no deal, we wouldn't see immediate obliteration because the companies can't just instantaneously switch off the lights, as it were, but you would see gradual disinvestment and job loss from the UK.
What about saving this $39 billion, though? Would that not alleviate a lot of those problems, especially in the short term?
Yeah, it's an interesting statement. I mean, if the UK wishes to have any kind of economic treaty with the EU going forward, it is going to pay that $39 billion, or whatever the amount is now, because that $39 billion figure was calculated on leaving on the 29th of March, of course, which we haven't done. So we've continued to pay into the European budget since then. No, I mean, I quote David Davis again, who said we would pay that money because we are a law-abiding country. If the UK were to renege on spending commitments it made back in 2014, it would also partially be robbing itself because European social programs and European Union infrastructure programs do actually benefit businesses in the UK to the tune of billions of pounds. So the UK is going to pay that money, or else it's going to be a priority. Who would want to sign a trade agreement with a country that reneges on its promises? Right. It wouldn't set a healthy precedent, and the credit agencies and the rest would not treat the UK kindly in that regard. So the $39 billion is not a negotiating chip in my mind.
Back to me, Alex. You know my point of view and my level of understanding of this because we've spoken over a drink before, haven't we? Mm-hmm. and
I'll never admit to speaking over a drink.
Yeah, I know that. Sorry, I didn't mean it like that. But that's what happened. Where do we go? Because I watched the House of Lords debate last night when they were trying to talk it down, and now they've said that they're not going to try and talk anything down. What's going to happen next, Alex? What's your prediction?
I look at all these various alternatives, Geoff, and I think the most likely outcome is that Boris Johnson will, to coin a phrase, stew in his own juices for a while to come. I think until the opposition parties, or the Labour Party at least, see what they regard as cast-iron guarantees that the no-deal scenario is ruled out, we won't see an election emerge just yet. It's distinctly possible that, that if and when they do agree to one, it may well be for after October 31st. We're not just not sure yet. But I think Boris in trying to emulate the presidential style of somebody like a Donald Trump. You know, the tool he has at his disposal, and which he's trying to do, is to go into campaign mode and use the so-called bully pulpit, presidential style, to lambast his opponents for being too cowardly to face the public. And that's his only strategy.
Do you think? Do you think that we're going to have to go and ask Mr. Tusk for an extension?
That's what Corbyn's
if only because Parliament will will that, and for the Prime Minister to defy the will of Parliament in that regard would be held in contempt of Parliament, and I think that would very steadily lead to his exit from that role and replacement by a caretaker administration, if you like.
And do you think that is going to increase the sort of derision that we see in society with Brexit fatigue?
Well, it is distinctly possible, yes, but I think we need to clear up a fundamental misconception here, in that there is a fundamental misconception out there that equates a withdrawal agreement with a deal. So all the withdrawal agreement does, if we get one and we leave, is to state the terms of the UK's departure from the EU. It says nothing about what kind of future economic relationship we would like to have. That would then be the groundwork for negotiations of maybe a comprehensive trade agreement, or to what extent would the UK want to stay in the single market or the customs union. That process could take years. So, if you think it's all over, it ain't. No. The only way that we would get a quick end to Brexit is if the UK changes its mind and decides to not leave.
But then surely that is an end of democracy. You're going to have 17.4 million people just up in arms and never wanting to vote again. You will lose the trust.
I mean, there are worse things that can happen to even a democracy than being given another opportunity to vote. But
But what happens if they lose that one? Is it the best of 5?
What would happen, Claire, I don't think unilaterally revoking Article 50 is going to happen. I think in terms of respecting the referendum vote of 2016.
But legally, surely that has to go ahead. If you want to revoke it, you have to put out Article 49, which is the only way that you can actually rejoin the European Union.
No, until 11 o'clock p.m. on the 31st of October, the UK has the unilateral right to revoke Article 50 whilst it is still a member state. If it did not do so by that point in time, then it would have to go through the Article 49 process. But whilst we are still a member of the EU, and I say the UK government can change its mind at any point it likes up until then. But I personally, I don't think that's going to happen, because that would be seen to be a flagrant disregard of the 2016 vote.
Yeah, answer me this. Why are we so keen to stay with the 550 million declining market when there's 2.2 billion out there that want to do deals with us? They want to start trading with us. Why is everyone so adamant about this?
Well, I mean, there are two ways to answer that. The first one is that as a member of the EU, our number one and number two export markets already are the US and China anyway. So from the perspective of trading with these other countries, it hasn't done the UK any harm in that regard. And Germany, as a pivotal member of the EU, has about 4 times the volume of trade with China than we do. So that the notion that exiting the EU is somehow going to replace our economic vitality with getting into the American or the Indian or the Chinese markets is a bit of a misnomer, because we already do in the case of the US and China.
Yeah, but they benefit more with their cars.
Herein is the problem, Claire. The problem is in this misplaced focus on trade. The most important economic interactions nowadays are not just simply through trade or trade agreements. They lie in the complex international nature of production that we have. And most production takes place within physically adjacent regions, whether it's Europe or America or East Asia. So if the UK were to turn its back on membership of a single market, it would be shutting itself out of a market of 500 million for the prospect of trying to gain a trade agreement, say, with the United States, where it would be very much the junior partner.
But exactly,
and in
for
terms
the reason...
of what it would gain through those trade agreements, I don't see anything to be gained other than maybe some narrow sectors such as parts of financial services.
But for exactly the reason you've just said, it shouldn't matter if we were part of a bloc. The world should be our oyster. We should be doing these international deals all over the place rather than relying on that bloc mentality of being part of a single European market.
Yes,
That's exactly
the
argument you just said.
My answer to that would be that focus on trade deals is pointless. I mean, trade deals mean nothing unless you actually have the volume of trade with these countries to begin with. When people talk about the Commonwealth, whether they talk about Canada or Australia or India, our volume of trade with those countries is trivial. So if you were to have a free trade deal with Australia, that's great. Australia's already, as you can probably tell by my accent, I'm Australian. But when you actually look at what would the UK sell that Australians would want, that's a very problematic question to answer. You might well say financial services. Well, that's great. Australia has a banking sector which does very well internationally anyway, so the opportunities there would be limited. If you talk about trying to get access to sectors like telecommunications, well, the Australian government has some restrictive covenants in place to limit foreign ownership in those key sectors. So you kind of show out there. You're then looking at what retail. There's nothing really to stop here if you're the likes of Tesco going into Australia, but they don't because Australia has two of the largest retail companies in the world in the top 20. So even countries like that would have so-called similar or same laws or legal system as the UK. The opportunities to actually get in are limited, and the opportunities to actually, in terms of manufacturing, are even more limited because the supply chains that we look at are all built around this thing called just-in-time. So companies like to be able to shift things within a day. Yeah. And whilst you can roll on and roll off on a ferry to Zeebrugge, you can't do that to the United States or Peru.
Our line is breaking up with you, Alex, and so we're struggling to hear some of your answers. But final question for our listeners on our Brexit Understanding Brexit podcast. Does it all fall back on the border control between Ireland and Northern Ireland? Is that where everyone's arguing about? Is that it?
You've reminded me of something here, Geoff, and I think if Boris Johnson had a wild card to play, it would be to go back to the European Union's original withdrawal agreement offer and only have the backstop provisions apply to Northern Ireland. If you recall, that was their original position, but Theresa May then railed against it after Arlene Foster rang her up in an irate phone call and said, never, never, never. So then we had Theresa May say, I cannot agree to anything that would undermine the constitutional integrity of the UK. It is remotely possible that Johnson could throw the DUP under a bus by simply having a backstop applied to Northern Ireland. Yeah. And that might well get a withdrawal agreement through Parliament, and then the UK would be free to go off and sign trade deals if it so wished after a transition period. Yeah. But I think, such as his political fragility at the moment with the numbers he has in Parliament, that I don't think he would risk that.
What's DUP? They've 17 or something from memory, is it?
How many MPs do they have? About 10?
10. Sorry, I got my numbers wrong. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, well, listen.
Thank you for answering all our questions. It's amazing to be able to talk to someone who has a lot of the answers.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, Claire, I don't know what your own stance on it. You ask really important questions, and it's a sort of question that you need to be got to grips with, I think, anyway.
Yeah. Great stuff. Next time, we'd like to book you to come into the studio, if that's okay, Alex, rather than doing a conversation over the phone. This is a pivotal.
I enjoy that a lot more, I think.
Yeah, a pivotal catch-22 sort of situation that we're in at the moment. Next.
Well, it is. Yeah, I mean, it is. If you start dealing with absurd scenarios, such as opposition voting to keep the Johnson government in a confidence motion, and the Johnson government, trying to vote itself out, as it were. I think. Yeah. This is the level that we've now got to,
Wow. It's all change, isn't it? And are we the laughing stock, do you think?
Well, I mean, if you're in the situation whereby you've got someone who's, come in, thumping his fist on the table saying he's going to renegotiate and he's going to leave come what may, and then he finds himself being a presidential wannabe, being hostage to a parliament. Yeah, and then, you've got a government that technically can't govern, can it?
No.
We're going to rise like phoenixes from the ashes. That's my thought. Optimism.
Well, I'm concerned in that.
We're losing out. We're losing our connection with you. Alex, thank you very much for joining us here on Solihull Radio. I'm going to get back in touch with you because I've got a feeling that we could make this a regular occurrence.
Yeah, that would be good, Geoff. Yeah, I'd like that.
Great stuff. Take it easy, Alex.
Bye.
All right, mate.
Solihullradio.com